Well, I'd like to thank all of you here today for our November presentation of the Kent Miller and Quinton Reeves lecture series. Today we are going to have Professor or Dr. William Smith, Associate Professor of English in the Humanities Department, here talking to us about the disappearing Anglo-Saxons. Dr. Smith has a Bachelor's of Arts from the University of North Texas in English, a Master's in Arts in English from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a Ph.D. from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And if you don't know, the fact that he got those degrees at Chapel Hill is kind of a big deal. He has multiple academic publications, including a unique English
Ethnogenesis.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say too. Published in the American Notes and Queries, Statistical Analysis and Boundaries of the Genre of Old English Prayer, in a book called Meeting the Medieval in a Digital World, and an essay also in another book, Rape, Identity, and Redemption, Teaching Sir Gowther in the Community College Classroom, Teaching Rape in the Medieval Literature Classroom, Approaches to Difficult Texts. And also he's been teaching here since 1999, and he is a former faculty member of the year. So we are very privileged to have him talking to us today. So from that point, here you go.
Thank you, Dr. Shardievsky. Those papers sound really boring, so I'm not going to talk about any of that kind of stuff. Nothing that's difficult to pronounce, if at all possible. So I'd like to actually start with a question, because I'm a teacher. When you hear the term Anglo-Saxon, what does that word or that term mean to you? Anybody? Yeah.
To me, that term relates back to before the prior times where it was actually it was mostly languages being spoken before the French invasion of the England,
okay. And
that's why I think it is in terms of Anglo-Saxons,
okay.
where they later integrated to find the modern English language. The term goes back, I think, to the late 19th century, and I'm not sure if I'm correct about this. But
I'm actually going to talk a lot about where the term comes from and how far it goes back. But yeah, you're absolutely right. So the term can refer to people a long time ago living in England. Anybody have a different conception, though, when you hear the word Anglo-Saxon? You don't necessarily think about the past? Anybody? White. Okay. All right. Good. Thank you. Put that one right out. Yeah. I appreciate that softball. Okay. So I'm going to talk about a lot of different meanings of the term Anglo-Saxon. This term does have a sort of special meaning for me because my Ph.D. is in medieval English literature. That was my major. Specifically the field of Old English literature, which is literature produced before about the 11th century. In England, or the time period generally referred to as Anglo-Saxon England, before the 11th century. I thought that it would be a really clever idea to demonstrate just how sort of entangled this term is in my professional life by counting the number of books in my office that have the word Anglo-Saxon in the title. And I found quite a few. In fact, I found that I have over 20 books in my office with the word Anglo-Saxon in the title, and probably more than 100 that have the word Anglo-Saxon in the text somewhere. I then realized I probably could have saved time and made that point much more quickly had I just remembered that the word Anglo-Saxon is in the title of my own doctoral dissertation. But what's done is done. I like stories as a teacher. I like the way they sort of explain things and set up ideas about the past and about the present. So I'm going to tell you a couple of stories today. The first one is about the past. It's about what we know about the past, about how we know what we know about the past, how little we know about the past, and about the role that research plays still today in the continual revision and clarification of what we thought we knew about the past. But the second story is about today. It's about the world we live in, it's about the way politics shapes that world, and it's about the way language both shapes and is shaped by the way we interact with other people. But mostly what I want to talk about is the intersection of those two worlds in those two stories. So about the past meeting the present and the scholarly world meeting the political world, with the point of trying to explain to you why I no longer use the word Anglo-Saxon when I talk about what I do, at least as much as possible wherever I can. So let's start actually with a story that I tell my students every time I teach British literature. This is a story about England, about English history. The story goes basically like this. Before the medieval period, there was no England. That term, England, doesn't get used until about the 9th century, the first time. That doesn't mean, of course, that the island that England exists on now didn't exist. Obviously, it was there. But that island had been, from at least about the 1st century BC, known as Britannia, or the land of the Britons. I hate technology. Thank you. So the Britons were the people who had lived on the island of Britannia from probably about the Iron Age, at least, forward. These are people who spoke Celtic languages. These are languages that evolved into modern Irish and Welsh and Scots Gaelic. In about 43 AD, that island, Britannia, was conquered, or at least parts of it, by the Roman Empire. The Romans stuck around for about 400 years until problems back home in Rome and possibly economic decline in Britannia forced them to abandon the island. Then in the 5th and 6th centuries, barbarians from the Germanic world, by which I mean not just Germany, but mostly like Denmark and the Netherlands and that area, came over to Britannia and invaded. These barbarians came from 3 tribes mainly, known as the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes. And since the Romans had left, there was not much protection for the island, and so the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes overran the island, conquering much of it and forcing the Britons to retreat to areas in the north and in the west, so like in Scotland and Wales and Cornwall and even to Ireland. The Germanic tribes, now known just as the Anglo-Saxons because, efficiency, they established themselves on the island. They installed new forms of government, a new language, the language that we now know as Old English. And within about a century or so, Christian missionaries came from Rome to convert the Anglo-Saxons to their religion, which the Anglo-Saxons heartily embraced, and the rest, as we like to say, is history. And that's a nice story. It explains a lot of things. It has nice conflict and resolution, and I've been telling it, or some version of it, for about 25 years in my British literature classes. The only problem with the story is that it's pretty much a lie. And really, I've known for a long time that parts of it are a lie, that parts of it are an oversimplification of history. For example, though we're pretty sure that those Christian missionaries did come to England in 597 AD, a mission that was sent by Pope Gregory, we also know that England had existed, Christianity had existed in England since probably about the 3rd century. In fact, St. Patrick was a Briton who was Christian, obviously, and was sent to Ireland to help Christianize that island, for which feat, of course, we revere him by drinking green beer. But obviously, that was several hundred years before the invasion of the Anglo-Saxon tribes, so Christianity must have been around. We tell the story because it's a neat story. I don't mean it's a cool story. I mean it fits neatly, and it explains some things that are important in the sort of larger story of the conquest of England, the development of English culture. We know this story primarily from the writings of a monk named Bede, who wrote a book called Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum in the first decades of the 8th century. Now, for those of you whose Latin is a little rusty, that title translates to the Ecclesiastical History of the English People. This is pretty much the key historical source we have for the period I'm talking about, the early history of Britain. But the title of the book is kind of telling. Bede is writing a history of the English people, or the Gentis Anglorum, actually more precisely, the people of the Angles, which as you recall is one of those three tribes, the Anglo-Saxons and the Jutes. He's not, in other words, writing a history of the Britons. Now, I don't want to give you the wrong idea. Bede talks about the Britons. It's not like he starts his book with the invasion of the Angles and Saxons, but his point isn't to talk about British history. His interest in telling this story is in showing the main actors, the heroes of the story, if you will, as the Anglo-Saxons, or at least as the title would suggest, at least the Angles. And again, I've known all that for a long time. I've known that we can't really trust Bede to be a completely neutral source. And I've known that the early history of Britain is maybe a little more complicated than Bede lets on. But the broad outlines of the history that Bede suggests is something that I think most scholars have accepted, most specifically the idea of what we call sometimes the Adventus Saxonum, the arrivals of the Saxons in this 5th and 6th century. Or rather, I think most scholars have accepted it. I know I accepted it for a long time, until this summer, to be honest with you. Because this summer I read a new book by a scholar named Susan Oosthuizen. She's a professor of medieval archaeology at Cambridge University. And actually, I first encountered her ideas on a podcast, for the BBC podcast. She was interviewed about her new book, called The Emergence of the English, and the theories that she sets out in that book. And I listened to the interview on my way to campus, parked in my parking spot, and then before I even went in my office, I ordered the book because I was so angry, not because I was excited. Some of you know me well enough to know that I am basically a bad person who enjoys few things more than getting angry about how wrong someone else is about something. And so I wanted to get this book just so I could kind of revel in her wrongness. Her argument, in a nutshell, is that many parts of the story of the Anglo-Saxon migration and conquest are just not supported by the archaeological record. She says, if we had seen this total displacement of the Britons by the Anglo-Saxons, what we'd see in the archaeological record is disruption, signs of change in the 5th and 6th century. But in fact, what we tend to see most frequently is continuity from the late Roman period into the period that we have traditionally called the Anglo-Saxon period. She points out that we could look specifically at the evidence of property boundaries. In the Romano-British period, which is the term we often use to describe like the 1st through 5th centuries AD, property boundaries were often marked by like silted ditches and paddocks and hedgerows, and many of these are still evident in the archaeological record. These are not them. But this is a good illustration of property boundaries. And so she says, when we look at other examples of this kind of ethnic displacement where a new group of people comes over and displaces an earlier group, usually those property boundaries are sort of reshuffled. New people comes in and they redistribute the land in different patterns. They don't keep all the same hedgerows. But in many places in England, what we see is no real change in those property boundaries during that period where we would expect them. In a few places, we do see evidence of new settlements in the later 5th and 6th centuries, which either ignore or change the pre-existing boundaries. But in most places, the boundaries that have been in place for centuries seem to have been retained. In some cases, she suggests, evidence of cultural change does exist, but has just been overstated by historians. And by the way, one thing I learned reading this book is that archaeologists think of historians as charming little storytellers instead of, scientists. She's pointed out, for example, that some aspects of material culture, like, let's say, jewelry from this period, has been interpreted as Anglo-Saxon because it looks different from previous jewelry. But she points out that there are actually lots of individual elements inside that jewelry which we can see in Romano-British work, which suggests sort of evolution rather than replacement. She argues that place names, for example, in what we call the Anglo-Saxon period, often show evidence of either Brittonic, in other words, from the Britons, or Latin elements, right? So that we don't see a complete change in the name of the place, as we might expect. And maybe most importantly, she reminds us that while we have this kind of evidence that questions the traditional narrative, the only real evidence we have that supports the traditional narrative is the work of authors like Bede. And Bede clearly has political and religious motivations for telling the specific kind of story that he tells. So, in other words, Oosthuizen is arguing that large-scale Germanic invasions may never have actually occurred at all. Certainly it seems to be true that some people migrated from the Germanic world into what we now call England, but those migrations may have been much more gradual rather than an immediate conquest, and much more limited in scope than we've previously suggested. Yeah.
So, in the term of you applying with England, are you talking specifically about the British Isles in general, or are you talking about...
I'm talking about England, the national area inside of Britain that we normally identify as England. Yeah. She also argues that even if there is truth to the stories of Germanic migration in the 5th and 6th centuries, calling the period which followed that migration the Anglo-Saxon period is forcing this sort of falsely unified, homogeneous view of what must have been a very diverse culture. In other words, Britons didn't go anywhere, right? And we know that there was also migration from other parts of the world during this period. So saying it's Anglo-Saxon England is privileging this one group of migrants, if they even migrated, over other people that were already there. Throughout her book, for example, she avoids ever using the term Anglo-Saxon to talk about periods. She takes what we call the Anglo-Saxon period and divides it up into 3 periods, like it's late antique, and early medieval, and pre-conquest, or something like that, as ways of sort of avoiding characterizing the period in the way that we traditionally have. Now, don't get me wrong. There are some problems with Oosthuizen's theories. It's not a slam dunk by any means. For example, language, I think, is a real question. There's no doubt that the language spoken in England changed during these centuries. We first see evidence of the language that we now call Old English in the 6th century, and by the 7th century it was already being used to record laws and land charters, in other words, in a very official capacity. Old English is a West Germanic language, which means that it's most closely related to languages spoken in like medieval Frisia and the Netherlands, etc. And so there's a lot of question. If Germanic peoples didn't overwhelm Britain and the British people that lived there before, how did the language change so much, and why would it have changed so much? And I want to point out, it's not just language, it's also literary culture. I am not an archaeologist. And so there are parts of Oosthuizen's book. She spends a good chapter on the concept of what she calls shared property rights in the late Roman period. So like common areas where people shared the property. And let's just say I found those parts of the book challenging, is the word that I'll use, and not particularly interesting to me. I'm a literary scholar. So the questions that I have about her argument have to do with the way we think about Old English literary works. The most famous Old English literary work, and the only one that most people have ever heard of, is Beowulf. And this is the first page of the Beowulf manuscript. And Beowulf is a text that I've spent pretty much my whole career thinking about. And to be honest, I'm not sure how to think about Beowulf in the light of Oosthuizen's theories about the culture of England at that time. Beowulf is a poem very much about the Germanic world. All of the action in the poem takes place in Scandinavia. around the 6th century. In addition, the poem refers to many figures of Germanic legend and myth. And so even though the poem doesn't refer to its characters as Anglo-Saxons, which wouldn't have made sense because they weren't in England, they were still in the Germanic world, it certainly seems to be the kind of poem that we would expect to appeal to a primarily Germanic or Anglo-Saxon audience. We don't know exactly when Beowulf was written. Most scholars would date it to the 8th or 9th century. So what we're saying is by around the year 800, a poet could look at telling a story, a 3,000-line poem about Scandinavian pseudo-history, and think, that'll be an easy sell, right? So I think we have some questions. How do we explain the existence of Beowulf? And I want to make clear, Beowulf is not exceptional in this regard. There are quite a few Old English works about the Germanic world and Germanic figures, and there are none about British culture or myth or legend. So how do we explain the existence of Beowulf and this clear shift in literary attitudes and interests if, as Osthuizen suggests, there's no preceding and precipitating shift in population? In other words, the people don't change. Why do ideas and language change so much, at least as we see it in literature? And honestly, I don't think she has completely satisfying answers to that question. And by the way, she admits personally that language is still the weakest spot in her argument, the part she's still trying to figure out. But she does suggest some possible ways to think about the appearance of Germanic cultural elements, both literary culture and material culture, in the centuries following the fall of the Roman Empire. She makes the point, for example, that English today is spoken by about 1.5 billion people around the world, largely in countries with no significant, what we call English ethnic identity, right? In these cases, the dominance of English has to do more with things like trade and, frankly, the central place that the British Empire played in the 18th and 19th century and the United States has played in the 20th and 21st centuries. Perhaps, she suggests, the appearance and eventual dominance of Old English in Britain is just the result of the political dominance of the Germanic tribes back in the Germanic world. In other words, sort of a like center of gravity theory, that because they were so powerful, a country like England might have adopted some of their languages and other aspects of culture, similar to the way people speak English in other parts of the world. By the way, if you ever get a chance to read Osthuizen's book, the best part of it is when she makes an argument about how archaeologists might interpret the presence of IKEA furniture throughout England, because it's obviously very popular. And she said that 500 years from now, you might look at it as evidence of a Swedish takeover somehow. Now, what she's saying basically is that maybe people in Britain started speaking Old English partially as a result of either economic necessity or even just cultural fashion. I don't want to say English was trendy, but the idea was that it was the popular language. And if you wanted to be a player in the early medieval world, maybe English was part of that. Now, if she's right, and I want to be clear, I'm not saying she necessarily is. This book is very controversial, even in my field. But if she's right, then the way we think about Old English poems like Beowulf probably needs to change. Maybe these poems about the Germanic past aren't about Anglo-Saxon people in Britain reaching back to their own cultural heritage, but rather a largely British population in Britain, with some Germanic immigrants, almost certainly, forging a connection to the Germanic world because it suits some particular conception of themselves and their history. Seen in this light, Beowulf and other examples of Germanic culture and mythology in Old English literature represent parts of a larger ethnogenesis myth. And that ethnogenesis myth, the definition here suggests, is a story about the founding of a particular nation, culture, or ethnic group. And I want to make clear that calling these stories myths does not suggest that they're fictional. Right? It doesn't suggest they're not true. When we use it in this sense, the important idea in that word myth isn't falseness, it's more the purpose for which the story is told. Myths are stories that cultures use to explain things. And in the case of ethnogenesis myths, they're stories told to explain where a particular people came from. They may be based in some kind of historical truth, but because they're told specifically for the purpose of explaining the origin of that group of people, I think we have to think carefully about the details in the story and how we interpret them. And I'd like to point out that we are not immune to ethnogenesis myths in the United States today. And if you don't believe me, tomorrow or the next day, go to an elementary school. The Thanksgiving story that we're going to tell next week, or we're going to act out in some ways next week, is a very important and very powerful ethnogenesis myth for us. It talks about where we come from a group of intrepid pilgrims who were seeking out a place to express their religious beliefs freely, and it talks about the kind of people that we are. People who value piety, but also cooperation and tolerance towards others. Most of us know that the Thanksgiving story, as played out in this clearly historical recreation, is overly simplistic, right? But I think we've actually internalized parts of that story to a degree that's a little problematic in certain ways. I think that many Americans likely believe that American society somehow descends from the Plymouth Rock Pilgrims. Groups like the Mayflower Society kind of perpetuate that idea. If you're familiar with the Mayflower Society, if you do a little bit of genealogical research, you can prove that you're in some way descended from one of those 102 passengers on the Mayflower. You can apply to membership in this group, whose stated purpose is to, quote, provide education and understanding of why the Mayflower Pilgrims were important, how they shaped Western civilization, and what their 1620 voyage and its impact on the world means today. Look at that language. The 102 Pilgrims shaped Western civilization by not dying and eating with other people, apparently. Members of this group, commonly known as sons and daughters of the Mayflower, you may have heard that before. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not about to tell you that new archaeological research is raising questions about whether the Pilgrims ever came here. But I am saying that I think we've given some kind of special privilege and position to that group of 102 travelers. I think when most Americans think about the Pilgrims arriving at Plymouth Rock, they think, and this is important, they think this even when they know better, that these were the first people to arrive in North America somehow. Even though we know that by 1620, when the Pilgrims arrived, Santa Fe had already been established, Jamestown had been established and, in fact, had grown to multiple settlements. They had grown so much that by 1619, they already had established the Virginia General Assembly, is that the name of it?
House of Burgesses.
House of Burgesses, yeah, the first official governmental body in the New World. Fort Nassau had been founded by the Dutch in 1615. That's basically Albany, New York. All of this is while the Pilgrims are still back home.
Jacksonville, Florida.
Jacksonville, Florida, yeah, absolutely. The Spanish in Florida. My point.
People have been trying to colonize the continent for, what, I don't know, half a millennium by that point?
Yeah, and not all the people who had been trying to colonize had been successful. But when the Pilgrims came, there were other people here, and yet we still, I think, treat them as if somehow the Mayflower is where it all began.
Wasn't Jamestown established in 1608?
Originally, 1607, I think. 7, yeah. 1607, yeah. So my point is just that we often give special significance to certain parts of our history because we can use those parts to confer larger ideas about cultural identity, who we are, who we want to think we are. So we like the Pilgrim story because it's a nice story and because it paints the origins of America in certain colors. The colors of religious freedom and kindness to other and individual determination. And so it may be that people living in Britain in the early Middle Ages also found some special value in putting emphasis on the idea of Germanic heritage, even though the true story of the development of the English people was just more complicated than that. But, so what, right? Some of you have been sitting here very politely listening to me talk about things that happened 1,000 years ago, and while perverse people like me care about that kind of stuff, why should the rest of us care about whether the Anglo-Saxon invasion really occurred or not? I would suggest that one reason why is that this myth is more connected to all of us living here than you might suspect. In August of 1776, 1 month after signing the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, among others, suggested a design for an official seal of our new nation. For the front of the seal, he suggested an image of Moses leading the Jews away from Pharaoh, which is a great, I think, image, because it's like this clear reference to the idea of Americans as the chosen people and getting out from the yoke of oppression, etc. It was a popular motif. Benjamin Franklin also suggested something with Moses on the seal. But on the reverse of the seal, Jefferson suggested adding an image of Hengist and Horsa. And this is a quote from Jefferson's letter. "The Saxon chiefs from whom we claim the honor of being descended, and whose political principles and form of government we have assumed." Now, a little explanation is necessary here. Hengist and Horsa are two probably legendary brothers and leaders of the Anglo-Saxons in Bede's history. They're cited by Bede as being the first commanders of the Anglo-Saxons against the Britons. So there's some interesting ideas in Jefferson's statement. The first is an old myth, which is easily dispelled, had been dispelled by the 19th century, by the way, that somehow the Anglo-Saxons were the progenitors of democracy. There's really no historical evidence for that whatsoever, so we can throw that part aside. But the other idea, and the more interesting one the one I'm interested in anyway, is this parallel that Jefferson is making between the founding of America and the invasion of the island of Britain by the Anglo-Saxons. And you can see it in his choice of military commanders of the Anglo-Saxons as figural representation on the seal. The myth of the founding of America that Jefferson is proposing here is one that has to do with invasion and conquest. It's a story, by the way, that runs counter to some of the ethos of the Thanksgiving story. In this version of the founding of America, Native Americans aren't our cooperators who share a meal with us, but rather they're cast in the role of the helpless Britons who are overrun by the militant invaders from the east, which may be a more accurate interpretation of our history, I don't know. But Jefferson's also sort of making this into an ethnogenesis myth by saying we are descended from Hengist and Horsa. We meaning Americans. So I think you can see how the findings of Oosthuizen and other people like her can ripple out into our own national consciousness. If America is descended from the Anglo-Saxons, but the Anglo-Saxons are kind of a mythical construction in the first place, then we should probably reevaluate some of our ideas about national identity. I was reminded of this fact in July of this year, when Republican Congressman Mike Kelly of Pennsylvania said in an interview that he was, quote, he was, it's spinning, he was, quote, I'll just read it to you, a person of color. I'm white. I'm an Anglo-Saxon. Now, I think there's a lot to unpack in Mike Kelly's statement, frankly. Among other things, he admits that his heritage is mostly Irish. So even if we accept the traditional story of the Anglo-Saxons invading and overrunning the Britons, Kelly's on the wrong side somehow. Kelly, there he is. For Mike Kelly, as the statement clearly indicates, Anglo-Saxon is just another word for white. And I'd argue that the term has this meaning for many Americans. Some of you are familiar with the term WASP, right? White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And it's seen as somehow like an especially American kind of identity. I've known about that usage of Anglo-Saxon for a long time, obviously. For most of my career, I was able to separate it from my scholarly understanding of the term Anglo-Saxon, the way that I understand that when teenagers like my daughter say literally, what they actually mean is not literally, but the opposite of that. But some recent developments in our society, not in my scholarly field, have made it more difficult for scholars like me to kind of brush off that usage of the term Anglo-Saxon. The biggest of those developments happened 2 years ago in Charlottesville, Virginia. At the now infamous white supremacist rally in Charlottesville in 2017, many of the marchers carried signs and paraphernalia littered with medieval, or more accurately, faux medieval imagery. So you can see the sort of, in fact, this is technically called Viking Shield #1 from the company that makes it, the shield with the black eagle. This symbol on the flag back there is a rune, a Germanic rune, which is, again, part of early Germanic heritage. The attention that this rally garnered really just threw into bright light what most medievalists have known for a long time, which is that racists love the Middle Ages. Or really what they love is this fantasy conception of the Middle Ages they have, which is that the Middle Ages were somehow homogeneous. And by homogeneous, they mean exclusively white. In other words, before other cultures integrated into Europe. For racists, the term Anglo-Saxon has always meant white, and as Jefferson's proposed seal design makes clear, for these racists, the story of the Anglo-Saxon conquest of Britain is a story about one particular culture, a white Germanic culture, dominating an inferior culture. Now again, I want to make clear that scholars who study the Middle Ages have known about these racist ideologies and appropriations of the period for a long time. But for a lot of us, the events of Charlottesville represented a kind of watershed, a moment where we couldn't just ignore any longer the way white supremacists were laying claim and twisting elements of medieval culture to their own political ends.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
I know this sounds contradictory to the American Constitution, but if they're using it to meet their own ends, shouldn't such information be censored to prevent such discontent from happening again?
I am so happy to answer the question this way. That is not my job. But I'll talk about it all day long. You could well argue that, absolutely. These are just some news stories from the weeks after Charlottesville, where you can see coverage of the way medievalists were starting to, well, to be honest, push back against the white supremacist appropriation of medieval imagery, medieval elements, etc. One particular aspect of medieval culture that the white supremacists have long tried to make their own is the term Anglo-Saxon itself. Starting not long after the Charlottesville rally, some scholars, especially scholars of color, but not exclusively, began to call for a reevaluation of the term Anglo-Saxon. Should we be referring to Anglo-Saxon England? If for people committed to racist ideology, that phrase connotes an entirely white England and a historical, or really pseudo-historical, model for white supremacy. More immediately, should we as scholars of the period continue to refer to ourselves as Anglo-Saxonists, which is the term that for 25 years or so I've been using to tell people what my field, my specific scholarly field is. I'm an Anglo-Saxonist. These questions were asked at frequently throughout 2018, 2019, at medieval conferences and on social media, including on medieval Twitter. I'm so sorry to have to tell you that medieval Twitter is a thing. Not a great thing, but it's a thing. And earlier this year, those questions came to a head with a call for the International Society of Anglo-Saxonists to change its name. This society, which is usually known as ISAS, was founded in 1983 and has been ever since one of the leading scholarly organizations for people who study the stuff that I study. It's affiliated with the journal Anglo-Saxon England, which is literally the top scholarly journal for people in that field. They host an international conference every 2 years. It's a big deal, in other words. Prompted by the very public resignation of Mary Rombrand Olm, who was serving as vice president for the International Society of Anglo-Saxonists at the time, scholars in September of 2019, this has just happened 2 months ago, began to call loudly for the name to be changed. And at this point, I have to be honest with you, even though I really don't want to be. I was on the fence about the issue when it first came up. To me, it's not that I didn't care about white supremacy, but to me it didn't seem right to somehow let them win, to let the white supremacists take this term when it's our term, right? We're the ones who understand what the term means, and we were here first, is what I thought. But, of course, we weren't here first. By we, I mean scholars who were interested in presenting history as accurately as possible with no particular political agenda. I was reminded, and in some cases taught, by my colleagues who were pushing for this change, that the field of Anglo-Saxon studies has its roots in the very kind of white supremacy that's just now getting widespread media attention. As far as we can tell, the first person to ever use the word Anglo-Saxonist, the first person to ever be referred to as an Anglo-Saxonist, was the scholar John Mitchell Kimball. He first used it in the 1850s. Now, I knew this name. His name's on several important early scholarly editions of texts. But I didn't really know much about him personally. To me, he was just the name on the spine of the book. And it turns out he was a pretty nasty guy who used his scholarship to advance theories of the superiority of what he called Anglo-Saxon stock over inferior cultures like the Britons. Well, at that point, my mind was changed. I was on board with the name change. But even if I hadn't been convinced, I'm pretty sure that the reactions of white supremacists to the media coverage of the question of the name change would have done the trick. On September 19th of this year, the Washington Post ran a story about the controversy within ISAS. By the way, anytime the Washington Post is talking about the stuff I study for a living, it's a bad day. There's never a good thing to come out of that in my experience. The story wasn't bad, it was pretty reasonably written, but as is almost always true on the internet, the real show was in the comments to the article. And the comments ranged from the misinformed, medieval Europe was white, Anglo-Saxons are a white ethnic group, etc., to the mildly racist, if these people, and I'd love to say I'm not sure who they mean by these people, but I'm pretty sure I know who they mean by these people, hate whites so much, why did they decide to study medieval Europe in the first place? To the outright offensive, like this one that compared Mary Rombrand Olm to this reconstruction of the earliest British skeleton that we have. I'm not showing you, by the way, the worst comments. The worst ones are too bad to show here because they included threats of violence and rape towards Dr. Rombrand Olm. I don't have a lot of hard and fast rules in life, But one of them is that if the Nazis don't like what you're doing, you're probably doing the right thing.
So there's actually a saying that Mike Moncrief did, and it was in politics, but it can apply to this too. If 60% of the population don't like what you're doing, you're probably doing the right job.
Well, we'll come back to 60%. That's an interesting number. It's going to be important.
Yeah, I think it's most, I'll have to relook at the quote again.
Well, let me be clear. I think that unquestionably my decision to back this name change was made easier by the fact that earlier this year I had read Susan Osthuizen's book. When the right thing morally happens to coincide with the right thing academically, the choice gets pretty easy. In other words, if using the term Anglo-Saxon England and calling ourselves Anglo-Saxons is giving comfort to white nationalists and misrepresenting the historical and archaeological record, then clearly we need to make some changes. Now, this story isn't over. For one thing, 60% of the organizations of ISAS, of the International Society of Anglo-Saxons, did vote to change the name. So far, unfortunately, no suitable replacement name has been presented. I have to change that. Yesterday, I got an email suggesting that the organization might be referring to itself now as the International Society for the Study of Early Medieval England. So maybe ISEEM, I don't know what we'll call it, but maybe that's where we're going, I'm not sure. Usually it's just referred to as the organization formerly known as ISAS or ISXX, while we wait to fill in those gaps. Much more troublingly, the controversy has deeply fractured my scholarly field. Scholars of color and their allies are often feeling vulnerable and marginalized by the conversation, by the fact, for example, that 40% of the organization was not convinced by the comments of the white supremacists that that was enough to change the name. More moderate and often more white scholars are sometimes feeling attacked for not being progressive enough in their desire to move the field towards justice. I just spent last weekend at a scholarly conference before the Southeastern Medieval Association. And while I was there, several of my colleagues told me stories of lost friendships, people they've been friends with for 10 years who are no longer speaking to each other, and just fear of speaking out on either side, by the way. People who think we should change the name, people who think we shouldn't change the name, etc. The stakes are so high that people feel afraid. And that's unfortunate. I think probably that has more to do with the deeply divided political world that we live in than with the facts of the historical controversy. But the fact that there's been some fallout from this discussion does not, to me anyway, invalidate the discussion or the decision to move away from these problematic terms. In a recent article about the controversy, the historian James T. Palmer wrote, and I'll actually read this one, responsible labeling is about finding languages to analyze the past effectively and in ways that don't distort it, and then finding ways to discuss that analysis in ways that are meaningful to us without distorting it again. In other words, if we're going to talk about the past in effective and meaningful ways, we have to start by using the best words. And for me at least, the best word to talk about the time period, the people, and the literature that I study is no longer Anglo-Saxon. Thank you.
Are there any questions? And of course, we must use the box to throw it.
Oh, the box.
Yes.
That part sounds fun. Please someone ask a question so I can throw this at you.
I got a question. I'll take the box. I'm right.
By the way, Scott's right. Carolina plays tonight at, I think, 6 p.m., so we have a limited time frame. Go ahead.
Okay, the question I had has to do with, like, if people look back at their own heritage or their own ancestry, could that be, I don't know, even a way to divide us more? Like, I don't know mine, but I've always assumed I'm Irish because I'm fair-skinned and redheaded.
Yeah.
Who knows where I come from? But perhaps. I don't know, is that maybe an answer?
Well, I mean, I think yes and no. This is going on YouTube, right? So I'll just say this. I recently got a text from a relative asking if, because I had done some genealogical research into my family, if I had found any evidence of Native American ancestry, because this relative had heard that their children could go to school a lot cheaper if I could find that. And I said, I think, first of all, I said, you might call Elizabeth Warren about that, because she, might have some advice for you. But I mean, I think that genealogical research is fun. Don't get me wrong, I have an Ancestry.com account. I like finding out which of my relatives were criminals, for example. I enjoy that part. But I do think there's sort of a dark side also if what we're doing when we're doing genealogical research is trying to talk about ethnicity and heritage. And Irish is a good example. The bottom line is, Irish ethnicity, like all other ethnicities, doesn't really exist, right? Not in a physical way. It's a cultural construct. And so if we're looking to genealogy to say, what percentage of this am I think that it could feed into this notion that somehow, a race or an ethnic group defines us as we move forward through the generations. To me, the most important thing is that we're all sitting in this room today, not where people in our background were 500 years ago. But that's just me. Jim, throw the box back to Jim. I really wanted to throw it at you, Jim.
That's okay. Hey, I couldn't guess it. I didn't play.
That's what I was counting on. Yeah, go ahead.
Question. Going back to the lady that you read that talked about change, was it maybe a migration versus an invasion?
Yeah, I think, again, there is certainly evidence of migration.
Yeah.
It's just a question of how we think about that migration. Again, if we think of it as, over time, some people from the Germanic world moved into Britain, as did some other people from other parts of the world. That's one thing. If we think of it as this migration happened, England changed from one thing, Britain, to something else, England, I think that's more problematic. I think that's more about, again, it's us looking back, trying to make sense out of things than it is about what it was like at the time.
What I was saying was time frame.
Yeah.
Migration takes time. Invasion, like the Normans come in, boom.
Yeah, and it's interesting, you mentioned the Norman Conquest earlier, because England, of course, had this play out over and over again, and the Norman Conquest in 1066 and the years after is another good example. But that was somewhat different. Or maybe in fact it was less different than we've traditionally thought. Maybe that's a better way of thinking about it. Because I think we've always known, it's not like everybody from France moved into England after 1066. The population of England was largely the same 100 years after the Norman Conquest than it was 100 years before. The places where it was different was the court and the church, basically. Unfortunately or fortunately, depending on if you teach in an English department or not, the court and the church were where most things were written. So the French language played an outsized role in England in the late 11th and 12th century. But I always tell my students when we talk about the Norman Conquest, I say, if you took a random cowherd in 1115 in a couple of 100 miles from London, they probably never met a French person in their life. Probably no one they knew had ever met a French person in their life. So the idea that there was a Norman conquest, it was very small scale. In other words, it was important politically and important, not religiously, but in terms of church administration. But it wasn't really important in terms of defining the population of Britain.
A conquest without a migration.
A conquest without a migration, yeah, absolutely. Such that, another thing I always like to tell my students, William the Conqueror was there at the Battle of Hastings in 1066 and then went back to France. I don't think he ever came back to England. If did, he may have gone one time, but he was king of England. Big whoop. He spent the rest of his life in France, in Normandy. Yeah. Other questions? Yes?
Do you think it may have been possible that... What? That's what the mic is. Do you think it could have been possible that a lot of the linguistic shift could have been something similar to what happened around 1066, where a lot of the upper classes were replaced by people of Germanic origins?
Yeah, so it's a theory called elite displacement. So if the elite in the culture, in other words, the political class, the top of the religious class, if that group changes in ethnicity and culture, then yeah, language can follow that. And I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. Oosthuizen doesn't like that theory either, for reasons that we can't get into exactly, but I think that's certainly another possibility. And really, the key to Oosthuizen's book, which has been maybe more controversial than it should be, because all she's really saying is, let's not be so sure. She's not saying there was no Germanic invasion, no Germanic migration. She's just saying we've been acting like we know for sure what happened, when really we don't have a lot of evidence. We're listening to Bede, one guy who spent his entire life in a monastery and had very clear agendas for writing the history that he wrote, and we've been treating that as if that answers all of our questions. And her point really is just there are other potential explanations, and elite displacement might be one of them.
Yeah. Who knows? Maybe
So the question I was wanting to ask was, do you think that there is circumstances of trade where the courts actually the courts and the upper nobility had to adopt the displaced Latin because it was as the main language because it was more of a cultural thing, or do you think it was perhaps more of an exchange of ideas from them bringing their own language?
I don't know. I mean, we are learning so much about trade in the early medieval period, and there was a case just a few months ago, this piece of pottery that was found on the southwest coast in Devon, I think, of England. Archaeologists had identified, and this is like 2nd century, I want to say, don't quote me on that, but 2nd century, and they've identified that it came from this type of the ceramic cask, fish-shaped cask that was used to transport oil that was made in Turkey. And that got some media coverage because, again, I think we think of that time period, almost 2,000 years ago, as people being much more isolated and sort of insular. But the more archaeology we do, the more we see evidence of clear exchange through trade throughout the European world.
But that contradicts this was before the Dark Ages, and the Roman.
Did I flinch when he said that? Dark Ages?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean, the early medieval period, that's probably a more appropriate term, and that's when the Romans were much more consolidated on the rule and at the height of their power. I think it was Pax Romania, so... Yeah,
and maybe that particular relic has to do with the fact that England was part of the Roman Empire at that time. But my point is just, I think we're having to recalibrate our ideas of contact between cultures, even in the early or even pre-medieval period, because archaeology is finding more and more stuff that clearly supports that idea. So, the idea, I don't want to bring the map up, but the North Sea area, so the area bounded by England on the west and Scandinavia on the east, and then I guess the Flemish area on the south, etc. The theory is that in what we call the early medieval period, so maybe 5th to 8th century or something like that, that was sort of an economic hub, that area. And so maybe you're right, maybe the linguistic shift and these other changes that we're seeing has to do with a lot higher levels of trade, and English maybe is a natural consequence of that. I don't know. Anybody else?
My question is, where do you see this all going? Where do you, tell me the future.
He has a crystal ball.
Well, I think there's a lot of futures. The future for my field, just professionally, I'm really hesitant to make a lot of claims because, I mean, right now it's just trying to stop the bleeding. It is really bad. I've told this story to Greg. I came from that conference and posted what I thought was an innocuous tweet, and within about 36 hours, at the request of my wife, I had to delete Twitter because it had gotten so bad, so much invective on both sides, and it was making me really upset. And so she said, no more Twitter for you. So right now it's really bad. It's hard to see what the path forward is. My hope is that we will become a more inclusive field, a more forward-looking field. We're looking to younger scholars, more diverse scholars, to sort of shake up our ideas of Anglo-Saxon England and of the field of Old English studies. And I just said Anglo-Saxon. I said I wasn't going to. Early medieval England in the field of Old English studies. One problem, to be quite frank, professionally, scholarly, is that my field is dominated by a bunch of old white guys. In fact, at a medieval conference I was at, there was a requirement to get in. You had to be an old white guy with a beard. Otherwise, you're not allowed, apparently. I mean, I was just guessing, based on the room I was in often. And so it is difficult for the field it's having some growing pains right now, I guess the way I'd put it. In terms of our understanding of the past, my guess is, this is a cop-out answer, but my guess is that we always find out that things are more complicated than we thought. It's never easy answers. We like the easy answers. The reason I tell my students the story about the Germanic conquest, or have, up before this semester anyway, have told them that story, even though I knew it was an oversimplification, is I'm just trying to get them to think about Old English literature, right? So they don't have to know all of the complications. But in our desire to make things simple, I think sometimes we're doing damage to the way, not just we think about the past, but the way our thoughts about the past reflect back onto us. So I'm hoping that things get better, and that what we recognize is that the world has always been a more diverse place. This is related, surely some of you have thought of this already, it's related to the Brexit debate as well, because a big part of Brexit has to do with immigration into Britain. And there's a group, but there are people living in Britain who want to stop immigration because they see immigration as a fairly recent thing that is changing who they are. And what Osthuizen points out is there's always been immigration in Britain. There's never been a period where people weren't migrating in and out of that island, which means it's always been changing. Change is the identity, in other words. You can't change from the identity because cultural change with new ideas is how that identity is formed, just like American identity is formed that way. Tom, yes?
Another way what you're saying might be put is a sort of change of center of gravity. The Romano-British are part of the Roman world.
Mm-hmm.
Then that breaks up. People move in from Northern Europe, and the center of gravity shifts over to Northern Europe.
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that's right, except we got what Osthuizen would point out is we have to be careful in thinking about why it shifts.
Yes, of course.
In other words, if we're suggesting that it's shifting because the population was different after the Roman period, after the Roman Empire broke up and the Romans left, that's more problematic. If we're suggesting that it shifted because of shifts, because of either economic changes or because after the Roman Empire broke up, the Germanic tribes were more powerful, and so people start looking that direction more, that's easier to reconcile with the archaeological record.
To me, the linguistic evidence is still very powerful.
I agree.
The archaeology, to say that there is a thing, there it is, game over. To say there is not a thing, you have to have some idea of what it would be if it were there.
Right, and so what she does is she compares the archaeological record in this period in Britain to the archaeological record in other places where we know there was ethnic replacement, where a group of people moved in and changed things.
Where else was there ethnic replacement?
I don't remember off the top of my head the ones that she used. She does use an example of the people of, so after the conquest, there was a move to some group of people from Brittany who were literally transplanted into, and I'm trying to remember where it was, and I want to say it was Devon, but I could be getting that wrong. So please don't quote me on that. You do. But where, in other words, it was a sort of politically motivated change, where the Norman government wanted this area to be more Norman, and so they moved people out of France into there, and things changed pretty dramatically. And so she says you can look at there, for example, the property boundaries. I mean, you look there at those property boundaries, you see them completely breaking up the pre-existing boundaries. She also, I kind of made fun of her section on shared property rights. For her, that's a really important part of the argument, because what she's been able to show is that rights of common, which is these areas, it's a foreign concept for Americans, these areas that were sort of commonly owned land that people farmed.
Collectively.
Cooperative, what'd you say?
Collectively would be the more
Collectively, yeah. That you can see those places retaining their ideas of shared property rights between the Romano-British and the traditionally known as Anglo-Saxon periods. In other words, the same field that had been divided, 3 people shared this field or whatever, you see it in 400, it's the same thing in 700. And she says that doesn't make any sense. If they've come in as a military force and actually killed these other people or moved them out of the area, why would they say, oh, but I heard that 3 people shared this field, so we'll keep doing that? It's the idea, again, of continuity, cultural continuity. I am not an archaeologist, I want to say that one more time, and so some of these ideas I'm not that familiar with, but there's an idea in archaeology known as the longue durée, which is a really bad French pronunciation, but I think it means the long period, the long duration, that we tend to look at these little individual changes, like in a century, for example, how things changed. But if you take a step back and look at a millennium, what you see is often continuity over that period. And so that some archaeologists are suggesting, I guess, sort of zooming out in the way we think about the evidence that we're seeing in the record.
Back to the linguistic stuff,
Oh,
if you'll excuse me. The other parts of the Western Roman Empire today, they speak languages clearly derived from Latin.
Yes, they do.
In England, it's just gone.
Yes.
This dirt level change all the way to languages derived from Old German. So how does that happen? And we are talking about centuries rather than,
Again, yeah,
generations.
and I'll reiterate, both Oosthuizen and I would agree, especially I, would agree that's the weak point in her argument, trying to understand language. But again, I think the bigger issue maybe, rather than thinking about how do we explain this one thing, is can we verify for sure that there was no large-scale migration? I really think the bigger question we should be asking is, why are we so invested in the idea of the large-scale migration? In other words, why do we hold on to it so tightly? If we loosen that grip and look at the evidence, we might still come to the same conclusion, or we might suggest, again, that it's just not as simple as we've traditionally thought.
That's well the foul stench of identity politics.
Well, but people have identities.
Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
Could it also be that we're talking at a time where Charlemagne and his legacy was very pronounced in Western Europe, and that was Germanic? Could it simply be the fact that they're copying what's the coolest, most powerful?
Yeah, I think that's an idea that she specifically suggests, is that it becomes sort of cultural fashion. This is just like if you go to Tokyo right now, you'll see kids wearing Levi's and a Taylor Swift t-shirt while they're eating at McDonald's. And these are people who've never been to the United States, probably never been within 1,000 miles of the United States, but because of the power of American culture, it looks very American there in certain ways, in certain places. And so, yeah, I think that's a possibility as well. Yes?
Could it be that your field is experiencing like the 15th century, where the Catholic Church, there's a Protestant Reformation, and basically there's a lot of infighting going on of like the actual existence of like the scholarly religious sources versus the science. Could that be essentially the equivalent of that growing thing that is going on today?
Well, yeah, could be. In some ways, I sure hope not. Because, of course, right after that,
no, I'm just
lots of
using-
people got killed. And
No, I'm just using that as
I know, but you see, my point is that what you're talking about with the Reformation is a schism that exists still today. You know? We still have the schism between Protestants and Catholics. Maybe less violent than it was 400 years ago, but it still exists. I hope that it... So, for example, the organization that used to be known as International Society of Anglo-Saxons, ISAS, there is a call for that organization to be just disbanded, you know, to burn it down, basically, to say it's a part of the past, it's too implicated in the racist roots of our field, we should just get rid of it. There are other people, very good friends of mine in some cases, who are trying to save the organization, to change its focus, to reform it, to move it forward, etc. And those two groups are at war. I mean at war with each other. And it's funny that I'm having this talk right now because right before this I was teaching Gulliver's Travels in my British literature class. And in the first part of Gulliver's Travels, the Gulliver goes to Lilliput, the people are 6 inches tall. And in Lilliput they have a hereditary enemy, Blefuscu, the land across the bay, which is pretty clearly France, by the way, if you're reading Swift. But he talks about how a big part of the problem between Lilliput and Blefuscu, they've been at war for centuries, has to do with their religious beliefs. Because their religious beliefs center on which side of the egg you're supposed to crack open. And he's talking about a soft-boiled egg that you scoop out. He says, and I always get it wrong, so I apologize if I've flipped it. The Lilliputians break their eggs on the big end, and the Blefuscans break their eggs on the small end. And he said, because of this, thousands have died. And we've been at war for centuries. And I really hope that's not what's happening to my field. Because that's what I feel is that we're talking about groups of people who agree. In fact, this was a quotation at one of the panels I was at this weekend. We agree on 95% of everything. And yet, we're killing each other, you know? And not literally, obviously, but metaphorically, in a scholarly sense, killing each other. I hope that it doesn't go the way of the Reformation. But I think the comparison is not completely wrong. Anybody else?
Well, thank you so much for coming here. Thank you all.